Thanks for sharing this end to end. I'm sure that when you're telling the story, you look back and bring back those memories. So in the first place, maybe just to start from the beginning, many people wants to drive culture change. Many people has great vision. I want to be world-class tech organization or tech teams. I want to follow Google or whatever big companies out there. So the vision is always great. Building the culture itself is tough. And you have this angle, which I find very interesting. Not many people do so. You actually make it such that it's an experiment. When you have an experiment, that means you have a hypothesis, you have things that you want to try to do, and you have some kind of a measurement, right? The outcomes that you want to try to achieve and measure whether you meet that over a certain period of time. Tell us why experiment driven is something that we should aim for when we want to build a culture.
So originally I started out to use that because I just made personal good experience with it. But in the end, over the years, I learned that this is definitely something I want to build as a culture, that we do more experiments. Idea is that we focus on learning, on fast learning, that we really need to try things out in our context before we actually know if it works or not. So that's also the case with what often are called best practices. Yes, they might work in a majority of contexts, but does it work in my own context right now with these very specifics? I don't know if I haven't tried it. Also, when we think of like the Kevlin model of the different domains in which like be aware, are we working on something that's really simplistic? Is it something that's complicated, but actually we have good structures and we know a lot of good practices that we can use? Or is it so complex that we really have to explore that space? We don't know yet. Mostly what I faced in software development, we usually always build something new. We work with new people. We work in a new domain. We try to discover new land. So it's a lot of exploration we need to do. For that, we need to experiment. We need to try something new. The other part of experiments that I really like, besides that we obviously can really have them help our learning, is about how you frame failure. So a lot of people are afraid to try something because we could get blamed. We could fail personally. Maybe I lose my face because of that, right? It's like there's a risk involved. So I think the most important part about building an experiment-driven culture is to make it safe to fail and to fail in good ways. Like that hypothesis that I came up with, I could not fully prove it. You could see it as a failure. You could also see as it's not a failure because we actually learned. It's a good thing that we learned that this part is not working. Other parts are working, so we can find something better. But it's a whole range of how we can perceive failure. I think it's from Amy Edmondson, like a spectrum of failure, where she ranges it from like blameworthy failure, really stuff that could be avoided, that maybe you should not go into again, to really praiseworthy failure in the sense of experimentation, of exploration, to learn fast. And I feel building that safety in can help in so many ways and allows us to experiment and to allow people feel safe to try something and not get the blame, but actually get the praise. So try something in a good way, in a safe way that also limits the fallout, basically, of what could go wrong. And I think we all need to learn how to do that better, and me included.
I mean, the spirit of Agile itself is basically a lot of experiments and trying out and, short feedback loops and things like that. You brought up two good points, actually. When we hear about best practices, sometimes we think, okay, this is the way to go. But you brought up a good point that sometimes we have to think about the context where you are at. Some people put it like you're not Google, so don't try to be following the Google practices, for example. So some best practices, even though it's best practices for many people, sometimes it doesn't work for your context for certain situations. So thanks for highlighting that. And I think I like the last part when you frame it as an experiment. So experiments sometimes can fail. It's not like a commitment that you will achieve what you intended to do in the beginning. So I think experiments allow you to frame it such that even if you don't meet the outcomes, it's kind of like a success in a way. Of course, you bring up the spectrum of failure. We all should aspire towards more praiseworthy kind of failure rather than some things that we underlook or something like that. So I think that's definitely a different kind of failure. You brought up about transparency in the beginning. When we started about these experiments, you brought up the point of building transparency, know where the team at, what kind of pain points and things like that. Why do you think this is important to build this transparency in the beginning of the experiment?
So what helped me with that is to have a baseline, to really have a look into where are we right now, not only from individual point of views, but also from a team point of view, because it might be a different perceived reality for everyone on the team of what we're doing right now. Honestly, I had teams where different roles were on, like, for example, a UX person, a developer, someone from quality, someone from product. All of them shared different things. What needs to happen, for example, to get an idea to production. Not any of them had the full picture. Only when they really put that together visually in front of them, they realized, oh, there are other things I never knew about or never thought about, and also pain points that come along with that. So to have that baseline, for me, is really important to not only face the truth of our current and acknowledge where we are right now with the good and the bad, because it's just fact. And then we have a baseline to experiment from, because then you can see the delta, basically. You can really know how things improved, or maybe not, or maybe they went in a different direction. So you have that information to evaluate your experiments. So transparency in itself, I find really valuable because you can really share also the pain and also hopefully inspire others to reduce the friction that you're currently experiencing. But then when you start taking action on that, you see that delta. Are we going into a better direction than before? It doesn't have to be perfect, just a bit better. Or are we maybe regressing? That could also be, right? But then you know, otherwise, how could you tell?
So I think, yeah, this comes back to, if I'm not mistaken, it's a scientific method in a way where you need to know where you start, right? Because sometimes we all tend to want to build a culture. Yeah, we know there is a problem. It's not written explicitly. We just kind of feel it's a gut feeling and we start our experiment and things like that. But at the end of the day, we don't know whether we are progressing or regressing. Right? So building this transparency and baseline, I think actually very important in any kind of experiment, so that you need to know at the end whether you are actually progressing, making good progress, and the changes is intended, or is something that is completely out of the blue where you didn't intend it to happen, but it happened anyway. So I think, yeah, this kind of transparency, I can see it's important. I think after you build that baseline, you have hypothesis in experiment or scientific method, you have this hypothesis. So tell us why we should build hypothesis when building culture as well. How should we come up with this hypothesis?
The hypothesis part is actually one that many people struggle with. And for me, it's also personally the hardest part. The reason I'm still doing that is it forces me to really write down what is it exactly I want to do and what do I expect out of it. Just that thought exercise, for me, is actually the most valuable part, even if maybe I haven't framed it perfectly, because wording is hard. Writing out hypothesis is also something tricky. Again, they don't have to be perfect, but it forces us to write things down, to have it not adapted afterwards as we go, but really see, okay, this is where we wanted to start out from. Maybe we discover better directions. It's totally fine to also cancel an experiment and try something else, but then it's an intentional practice. So formulating those hypotheses in itself, I felt always extremely valuable to clear up my thinking, but also then in hindsight to hold myself accountable. Am I really working on that? Can I prove that? Can I disprove it? How is it going? This is what I wanted to set out. If I want to change directions, again, that's fine, but I should be intentional about it and also be open about it.
So yeah, I think this kind of thought process where you want to experiment something, but if you don't write it down, sometimes it could happen also, things change and you go into different direction unconsciously. I think this is what we don't want to do, because that means you are running a different experiments altogether. I think having this kind of hypothesis stage where you write down or maybe make it clear to people who are involved, okay, this is the things that we want to experiment and this is the outcome that we want to try. So let's give it a go, everybody in the same picture, and give it a try.